All right. No one else has logged on in the last couple of minutes, so I think that we're going to get started. Um, I'm very excited to welcome all of you today to our program, Deepen Our Memories on Historical Trauma in the Jewish and African American Communities. And Rabbi Sonya Starr is going to present our program. She was ordained at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College in 1994, and for the past 21 years was rabbi at Columbia Jewish Congregation in Columbia, Maryland, uh, which she left in June of 2021 to pursue full-time social justice work. During her time at CJC, she helped her congregation create a sacred arguing policy, a social justice policy, and worked on issues ranging from marriage equality, local green issues, mental health awareness, equal pay for equal work, immigrant justice, and racial justice collaboration. Currently, she is an interim organizer at the Religious Action Center, where she is working in Pennsylvania on legislative redistricting and in Illinois on ending source of income discrimination, which disproportionately affects Black and Brown residents. So, with excuse me, with that, I'm going to ask everyone to please mute themselves if they have not already done so. And if you have questions, please type them into the chat. There will be times for verbal questions, but any questions that you have while the program is going on, please type into the chat. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rabbi Starr.
Thank you very much, Sue, and Bethel, for inviting me to speak to you today about historical trauma and its contemporary implications. For me, the exploration of historical trauma has been incredibly informative, meaningful, and accurate because it was not only an intellectual experience, but it was also an emotional experience. And to me, it shines an incredibly bright light on what I think is crucial for the Jewish community to understand in order to go forward in both a healthy and just way. So in order for us to all be on the same page today, there's just a couple of precursors to the discussion that I want to clarify. For the purpose of this webinar only, we will be talking about the historical trauma, in particular, of white Jews. The historical trauma of Jews of color is incredibly important, incredibly nuanced, and extremely difficult and different, and therefore should be a discussion of its own. So we're going to be talking today really about historical trauma of white Jews and white American Jews. Recently, I read an article by Karen Block where she described Ashkenazic Jews as white passing, ultimately meaning that we were allowed to become white, which I will talk about later on a little bit more, in the 1950s because we passed. When we looked different, we weren't considered white. This term and the use of the intersectionality of discrimination is an amazing topic, probably for another time. But for the purpose of this tonight's webinar, you'll hear me go back and forth between the term of white Jews and white passing Jews, depending on when I remember to change what I'm used to saying. Also for tonight, this afternoon, I've divided this presentation into 4 parts. And after each part, I'm going to ask for clarification, questions of clarification. But I promise that at the very end, I will love to hear your thoughts, your comments, and everything that you bring to the table, for that's what I learned from you. And enriches our discussion and any other time that I might be able to teach this. And so now to begin with, what is historical trauma? Historical trauma actually is derived from intergenerational trauma, which is a term that's been used in psychology for a very long time. Intergenerational trauma explains why abused children often either abuse their children or are married to abusers, why if someone escaped a traumatic fire, their children are never allowed to go near a bonfire, why a person who almost drowned does not trust any water sport and won't allow their children to play any of it. Trauma and the psychological scars of trauma are passed down from one generation to the next. Historical trauma happens to a group of people. So when any group, Native Americans, Blacks, Jews, Japanese Americans, anybody experience something because they are a member of that group, then that is historical trauma, both because it happened to the whole group and because they were members of that group. All trauma, historical trauma, takes 4 to 7 generations to work out. So for trauma happens, even if it happens only in one generation, it would still take 4 to 7 to work out, depending on A, who you read, B, if proper interventions are mitigating or taken place, and equally important, if the trauma is a once and done thing or if it's a recurring happening. But either way, a trauma takes at minimum 4 generations to work itself out. And it's always important to remember that human beings are some of the most complex beings on the planet, or at least as far as we know, and therefore not every person responds to trauma or historical trauma in exactly the same way. So some of the ways that historical trauma plays out in different people. One is PTSD, what we now call PTSD, especially, but not only, being hypersensitive to different triggers that remind you of your trauma, even if it is not traumatizing you at that time. So, for example, if a group of women go to the exact same party, all of them have their drinks spiked and all of them are sexually assaulted at that party as a result, that group of people will be historically traumatized. And anybody that they go back, let's say they live in the same sorority house and they go back to the same sorority house and they tell all the people that are residents there, every time they go to a party and they're given a drink and somebody bumps into them, or they look away, or they're wondering who the source of the drink is, that cup, that drink becomes a trigger for their trauma. It's one of the effects of historical trauma. But there's another one that is not just psychological, it's also physical, right? There is what's called epigenetic markers that exist, i.e., our body actually physically changes because of the trauma that happens to us. This was actually discovered on tests on mice. Mice apparently genetically love the smell of cherry blossoms. Go no, I didn't know that. You probably all did. But the scientists did is every time a mouse went near a cherry blossom, they shocked them, right? So eventually that same mouse that was shocked 2, 3, 4 times stopped liking cherry blossoms and would stop going to smell them, right? What was amazing about the epigenetic, the way they found out it was a biological marker, is when those mice then, after the shocking was long over, had children, those children would not go anywhere near cherry blossom smells, and in fact would be shown signs of anxiety every time they smelled it. So they had an inherited in a physical way, and even when they were taken out of the cage, so it wasn't trained, right? It wasn't watching their parents' behavior. They had inherited a marker that changed something that they used to like because of the trauma they experienced. And the latest thinking is that happens to humans. And I'll talk more about that when I get into the individual responses of Jews versus Blacks, but that our biology has changed because of the trauma we've experienced. There also are different kinds of trauma that are really important to understand when you're talking about historical trauma. There's the primary trauma that happens to me. I'm the Black man who was profiled and harassed by the police. Or it could be the secondary trauma. I'm his daughter sitting in the back seat and I witness it. Or I'm the spouse at home that listens to the anger and fear when everyone gets home. All are traumatized by this event in different ways. The first and the most crucial step, and truly the only way for anyone to truly heal from historical trauma, and I can't emphasize this enough, is for the trauma to end. It is impossible to heal from trauma if you're still being traumatized. And so the only way for anybody to, didn't realize that. Thank you, Rachel. I'll stop going back and forth. I didn't know that you were hearing the clicking. Thank you. The only way that trauma can end is for people to be removed from the traumatic experience. And that is because of 2 reasons. One is because healthy responses while being traumatized are not healthy responses. It is healthy for an undocumented resident in counties and states that actively work with ICE never to report any crime nor seek medical help because they are afraid that they will be picked up and be deported. But that doesn't mean not seeking help of any kind is a healthy response. What is healthy when you're being traumatized is not the same as what is healthy when you're living a healthy life. Susan Abingdon and Tamar Miller wrote, healing is the ability to think and act outside of trauma reactions, to live in the present moment, and to discern between real and imagined fears, to appreciate life's blessings and joys. That cannot happen if one is constantly being re-traumatized. So let me stop there and ask if there are any clarifications that before we go on, because I'm going to switch topics a little bit and look more specifically at white Jewish historical trauma. But if there's any questions, clarifying questions about historical trauma in particular, I'm happy to take them now. And Kay, why don't you just unmute yourself and go ahead? And then Rachel or somebody can check the chats because I haven't been monitoring them. Go ahead, Kay.
Yes, I wonder if you would spend a moment addressing two accompanying effects of trauma, ambivalence and denial. What you described in the mice can be assigned to both denial and ambivalence, which is to say, even though they're shocked, they're still attracted to the scent. It's not that they don't like it anymore, it's that they like it and they're afraid of it.
Absolutely, but it's hard to know with mice.
Well, of course, and it's hard to know with people too.
I don't know with the mice.
But it's hard to know too because people often deny their trauma for what can be generations, ongoing generations. So I just wondered if you would talk about that for a minute.
Absolutely, both feelings can live in the same person. The person can still like going to, let me go back to the sorority woman who went to the party, right? She can still like going to drinks and being party centers in that scene and still be triggered by it, right? That can both exist within her at the same time. It makes it more complex, right? And makes it more difficult to fester out. But yes, absolutely. And yes, I will get to the inheritance of historical trauma in a second, and when we start talking about Jews and Blacks in particular. Any other questions before I go on? Go ahead. Go ahead, Harold.
So I was just wondering about the taking 4 generations to recover from historical trauma. I just was wondering how one knows that it's 4 generations and so on. What's the evidence?
That's above my pay grade. I wasn't doing the studies. I can tell you what I read. Some people said it was 4 to 7 generations. I honestly have no idea how they figured that out. That's a fair question, but I don't know the answer. And yes, I can email Sue the article I mentioned about white passing. I don't have the link here, but I can send that to her so she could pass it on. Any other clarifying questions? All right, so let me go on and talk about the Jewish experience, the white Jewish experience. So much of the research of historical trauma in general actually began in Israel. So it's a really contemporary source of study around survivors of the Holocaust and their children. And in some ways, that might be an answer to your question about how they studied it. We've only had so many generations, but I don't know the answer. And it began by studying the effects on children, the Holocaust survivor themselves, and their children who were not born during the Holocaust. And now it's being studied on grandchildren and great-grandchildren as well. There are different responses to Holocaust survivors to historical trauma and the children of Holocaust survivors. So for survivors, there are basically 4 responses. One is being the victim, emotionally volatile and overprotective. Another is being very numb, emotionally detached, intolerant of weakness as others. The third is being a fighter, no flight at all, completely first knee-jerk reaction is to confront someone. And the last one is to get mitigating support, therapy, counseling, ways in which the trauma is mitigated and allowed you to live a healthier life. Children of the Holocaust had slightly different behavioral responses, but you can see where they come out of the others. There's a high need for control, obsession with the Holocaust, survivor's guilt, which is interesting because they weren't actually survivors of the Holocaust, but survivor's guilt is prevalent, attachment issues, stress, anger, and even PTSD for children of Holocaust survivors. Now, one of the things I think it's really important to remember when we talk in the American Jewish context, the large majority of American Jews are not survivors of the Holocaust, right? In fact, the large majority of American Jews are not even directly related to survivors of the Holocaust, but rather were survivors of a different trauma, which is the pogroms, poverty, and state-run discrimination in Eastern Europe, but not the Holocaust. And so when many of us talk about Jewish trauma, it is as if the Holocaust happened to me and my family, even though that's not the historical trauma we've experienced. And there are two reasons for that. One is the Jewish community's education since World War II has made Yom HaShoah, the Day of Remembrance, a cornerstone of the most Jewish calendars. So it is a commemoration that is marked in huge community gatherings throughout our country every single year since World War II. So most of us have grown up focusing on it as part of our life, whether it's our family's history or not. And also because it gives us, as white passing Jews, legitimacy as a persecuted minority. As bad as the pogroms and Russia was, there's nothing like genocide to say, I also was discriminated. I also am a minority. I also am persecuted. And we'll come back to that. For this reason, when one is really talking about white Jewish historical trauma, we're really talking about not only the Holocaust, but the pogroms, the Inquisition, the Crusades, and yes, as American Jews pre-1950s. We'll come back to that in a second, but pre-1950s, all Jews were not considered white, right? We did not white pass, we were not white, we were of color. So our history of historical trauma goes way back, and it continues. Some of our lifetime on this screen is also part of your lifetime. You lived through that transition. It is important to recognize, and this is only starting to be really talked about a lot, although it was talked a lot about in the 80s, and then it went into hiding, and now it's coming back, is that in the 1950s, when I would argue Jews became white passing, right? They came white passing at a cost. We became white in the 1950s on purpose because our goal was to Americanize, because we thought that Americanizing ourselves would allow us to be upward mobile. It did. And protect us, which it also did. Now, there was a cost to that, which is that anything that we did outwardly or in the society as a whole that showed that we were Jewish was at risk. So, for example, when you look at the shootings or the recent hostage taking, they're at synagogues, they're at kosher butchers, they're at daycare centers, right? They are places where Jews don't pass, but say, I am Jewish. That's why Karen Block talks about white passing. White Jews, it's white passing. Because we got acceptance in the 1950s at the cost that we integrated into the society. Now, having said that, passing as white worked. We were allowed to move up economically. We lived freely in safe neighborhoods. We were given institutional protection by those who had authority over us, barriers to school, country clubs, education, jobs, even were allowed to intermarry. We were allowed to become white just as long as our Jewishness didn't get in the way. Now I want to share with you, I'm going to share my screen, this quote, because I think it's a very powerful one about how historical trauma has worked in the Jewish community. Rachel Yehuda, the professor of psychiatry at Icahn School of Medicine in New York, wrote, "Some theorize that the Jewish bloodline has evolved for centuries towards the neurotic and the paranoid. And in fact, we actually have American white Jews have a higher rate of anxiety and depression diagnosis than the general population. Throughout centuries of persecution, they were the ones who made it out, who hid the best, or who left in fear before anything happened. The remnants of this, some claim, is a gene pool, remember the epigenetics, of tightly wound nervous systems, adrenaline networks ready to fire at the first sign of unrest. Others claim it's learned behavior. We watch our parents and grandparents wring their hands and hold their heads and sigh, and we do the same. Epigenetics splits the difference, suggesting a kind of biologically learned behavior passed from one generation to the next, faster than evolution and deeper than memory. This anxiety seems to come from a well-intentioned place that wants to keep us safe and healthy, and often makes us miserable in doing so." But that historical trauma, right, that is the definition of what historical trauma does to you. Long before many of us were alive, historical trauma lived in our bodies and our communities. Even though the original trauma today with white passing Jews happened to ancestors, either our parents or other ancestors far away. Since the 1950s, there have obviously been anti-Semitic acts, and I'm not going to deny their existence nor deny that they have grown, right? They have continually, the anti-Semitism is on the rise again. And obviously, as we all know from Texas, violent anti-Semitic acts. But what's different and important to acknowledge is that the actual institution and leaders, with the possible exception of Charlottesville, have made it clear it is not acceptable in the United States. And even in Charlottesville, the police, the mayor, and governor made it clear this murder was not to be tolerated. Anti-Semitic actions are considered crimes by the authority figures, and therefore are triggers in our contemporary society to older historical trauma, but not the continuation of that contemporary institutionalized trauma today. Having said that, when Jews who have an inherited historical trauma or themselves experienced trauma have not gotten proper treatment for this PTSD or triggers or other results of their inherited trauma, they are being triggered for very good reason. And the response should be, how can we help you get the help you need so you know the difference between a trigger and a traumatic event? So let me stop there again before I pivot to talk about Black historical trauma. And let me ask for clarifying questions about what I said. I just threw a lot of information out there, questions you might have about white Jewish historical trauma. Any questions? I'm going to take, some people came off mute. Does that mean you have a question? Aviva?
I have a question. So if you're looking at 7 generations, so that's like 200 years, basically. Are there that many periods? Like, doesn't that circle always happen? Like, has there really been that many periods of Jewish history where there isn't a re-traumatization every 200 years?
Correct. There isn't. Right. They're absolutely right. There isn't. Right. And if you're talking about the pre-1950s, there are people on this lot. That's part of some of the people on this call's life. We haven't even gotten really to one generation from the trauma of the 1940s and 50s in the United States.
Right. I guess I'm going historically back to like Middle Ages. Like, has there really been that many periods?
No, not many at all. No. Which is about as sad and scary a commentary as you can have right there. Right.
You know, I'm thinking about my parents' friends who had to change their names in order to be able to pursue the careers that they wanted to pursue. And the denial, I mean, that action is, and the trauma that's associated with that.
Which is where the term white passing is coming from. Passing has been used a lot in the GLBTQIA community, right? When we pretend to be straight, we pass as straight, right? And so the term white passing says, and that comes at a cost because nobody ends up knowing your life. You have to hide it, you have to lie, you have to deceive people, right? It's the same thing. It came at a cost. It also comes with a privilege. It's a double-edged sword. And that's the hard thing to negotiate. How do we live with both the fact that there's oppression in that statement and privilege at the same time? But that's the reality of our existence. Other questions? Okay, so I will keep going. Black historical trauma in the United States. So this is where it's so important to remember that even if, and I'm not arguing this by any stretch of the imagination, but even if the only trauma that Blacks experienced in the United States was slavery, that is still only 4 generations away, right? And we said 4 to 7 to work your way out of it. Not even had a chance to even get clear of that one before you're re-traumatized by Jim Crow laws, lynching, redlining, educational disparity, lack of mental health resources, police brutality, inadequate resources during COVID, death threats just this last month at historically Black colleges and other colleges of Black students. In order to fully understand Black historical trauma, post-traumatic slavery disorder must understand that they're still being traumatized by the same authority figures today who are supposed to protect them. And remember I said, one cannot overcome one's trauma if one is still being traumatized. In addition, not all of those in power acknowledge that their trauma is trauma. Another way of re-traumatizing a victim is by denying that anything problematic happened. So what I'd like to do with you is share a reading, a small sampling of the trauma, pain, and suffering that the Black community has experienced since coming to the United States. And I'm going to do it in the form of a reading Dayenu. Now, we all know that we still have Purim before we get to Passover, so I'm not trying to leapfrog over it, but this particular prayer lent itself. So we've already started reading the Haftorahs that get us to Passover, so maybe it's not too out of season. It's Dayenu literally means it would have been enough. But instead of a song of gratitude as Dayenu is during the Seder, this time think of Dayenu as it would have been enough to be validated as true trauma. Dayenu, it would have been enough if Blacks had been kidnapped and dragged halfway around the world. Dayenu, it would have been enough if Blacks had been enslaved, families torn apart, forced to work against their will, punished violently, if not killed, if trying to gain one's freedom. Dayenu, it would have been enough in 1916, 17-year-old Jesse Washington in Waco, Texas was burnt alive in front of thousands of people, almost all whites cheering. Dayenu, it would have been enough in Columbus, Ohio in 1944, an essay contest question was what to do with Hitler after the war. A 16-year-old Black girl wrote, put him in black skin and let him live the rest of his life in America. Dayenu, it would have been enough if in 1948, Black tenant farmers in Mississippi were severely beaten by 2 whites because he asked for a receipt for his water bill. Dayenu, it would have been enough in the 1950s in Cincinnati, white Americans threw nails and broken glass into the public pools to keep Blacks from swimming in them. Dayenu, it would have been enough if in August of 1970, the FBI directed Philadelphia police to invade the Black Panther office, arresting 14 Panthers, and then forcing 6 Panthers to strip naked in front of the press, so that the next day the photos of the naked men were published in the newspaper. Diana, it would have been enough if the last known lynching in the United States was Michael Donald in 1981. Diana, it would have been enough if in 1992 in Los Angeles, the 4 officers who almost beat Rodney King, a Dodger Stadium usher, to death for speeding, driving while intoxicated, and failing to yield were acquitted of all charges. Diana, it would have been enough if from 2014 to 2016, 16 million voters were removed from voting rolls across this country. Most were Black or brown. Diana, it would have been enough if high school geography textbooks in Texas in 2015 portrayed slaves as workers who cruised here on ships from their native Africa to toil in southern agricultural fields. Diana, it would have been enough if in 2016 in San Francisco, police officers described Blacks and other minorities as wild animals, cockroaches, savages, barbarians, and monkeys. Diana, it would have been enough if in 2017 at the University of Illinois, 42% of crimes reported on TV were done by Blacks, even though only 10% of crimes were actually committed by Blacks. Diana, it would have been enough if last month, Black university students across the United States had gotten repeated death threats because it was Black History Month. Diana, it would have been enough if offenders in Georgia today are 11 times more likely to get the death penalty if victims are white than if they're Black. Diana, it would have been enough if in the United States today, Black households are twice as likely to be food insecure than the national average. Diana, it would be enough if today police killed unarmed Blacks 5 times as many times as unarmed white Americans. Diana, it would have been enough today to consider any one of these incidents traumatic. The cumulative collective effect is the definition of historical and contemporary trauma. Someday, may we honestly add that Diana, it would have been enough if all Americans, including all white Americans, recognize the effect of institutionalized racism, using their white privilege to elevate Blacks and create a true representative democracy in the United States. I want to share 3 quotes with you. I want to share my screen again. This first quote is by Dr. David Williams, professor of African American Studies at Howard University. And he talks about what it takes to understand institutionalized racism. And he says, racism is built into the power structure and institutions in society, and white people are taught to propagate racism and not to see it. When you bake it so clearly into the system everywhere around you that you do not even know that you're doing something different, it's not even whether you acknowledge it's racism or not, you don't even know that you're treating one group of people differently than another. You don't even see it. You are re-traumatizing them every time you invalidate their trauma. Every single time. Because being traumatized by no one validating their experience as racism is trauma. Dr. Monica Williams, professor of psychology at UConn, applied the research of Holocaust survivors to African Americans, and she wrote, a current example, she said, is the dread that many African American parents face in talking with sons about potential police encounters. It's traumatizing for parents, and it's traumatizing for the kids. The scenario is part of a legacy that she terms shared stress. The feeling that you have to manage everything within your own community because you don't know what you'll encounter in the society at large. Will there be more trauma from the outside, or will they actually be allies who support me? And so you keep within where you know for sure the response you're hoping to get. Dr. Lovie Jackson Foster, professor of social work at the University of Pittsburgh, wrote, Historical trauma has morphed into a myriad of contemporary trauma. Over time, the social policies, the reaction to the Black community, the racism that occurs, it has created a cumulative trauma. You don't get through one trauma and then it dissipates. They just keep building on top of each other, one right after the other. There are symptoms of historical trauma for Black Americans, and they are different just like for every other group of people. Human beings react to trauma differently, but one of the most common is PTSD. There's also avoidance of white people, fear and anxiety in the presence of law enforcement, excessive worries about the safety of family and friends, very strict boundaries, no nonsense upbringings, because any movement outside the boundaries is not only problematic, it could be deadly. Often if poor, working one or two jobs, coming home exhausted, trying to enforce rules on kids who've been alone for a long time. Triggers become very different when understood in the context of historical trauma. Not enough Blacks volunteer for clinical trials of COVID vaccine because of the history of being lied to and used as laboratory rats, like in Tuskegee syphilis trials. Facing police and people with authority with a mask on, afraid to be mixed up with a masked criminal. Remote learning when behind in school, higher rates of financial challenges, i.e. no computer or Wi-Fi. Or high suicide rates among elementary school kids, 5 to 12 times as high as whites. So let me stop there for a second and ask if there are questions about any of that. I'm going to then get into a comparison, but before I switch gears, any questions that you might have? I never heard the afterlife of slavery, right? That's a good phrase. Any questions before I continue? Okay. So to this point, what I have done is not really controversial and is backed up by psychological studies. For that matter, most of what I've taught up to this point is me researching, reading, and reporting others' conclusions. But this next part is my interpretation, my understanding, and I will be upfront, it's controversial. But before I share my understanding of a comparison of American white Jewish and Black historical trauma, let me say that one of the many ways that those in power maintain control is by turning different oppressed groups against each other. And when this is done effectively, oppressed groups end up in a downward spiral of whose oppression is greater, who has suffered more. And the only person that benefits from that is those in power. On the other side of the coin, one of the greatest paths to empathy, support, and being a good ally is through comparing our understanding of our life with that of another person's. So this next section I offer is a white passing Jewish American trying to understand oppression in the United States, trying to be a better ally and still preserve my truth at the same time. My father, or Aviva, my father of blessed memory, once said the hardest thing he had to do as a parent was to teach his children how to both be proud of being Jewish and respectful of others who are not. I can only hope I have learned his lesson as well as he demonstrated throughout his life. Although anti-Semitism is on the rise, Jews today are not institutionalized, oppressed in the same systematic way that Blacks currently are today. The hostages in Texas within minutes, hours, had every law enforcer possible, including the FBI flying in, making sure they got out alive. Every elected official condemned the actions of the hostage taker. Anti-Semitism is social, it's cultural, and it is potentially deadly, but it is not systematic, institutionalized like racism, and the difference is crucial. Blacks often live in the same town, city, or state with authority figures who deny the systematic racism in our society. Blacks cannot recover from their historical trauma because they're still being traumatized. And while Jews are not, or so when our trauma is triggered, like in Texas, is not the same experience because all the power structures said that that was wrong. Put resources in finding the right people and making sure they do not hurt Jews again. After the Holocaust, Jews were validated by the United Nations, giving us a country because our trauma was trauma. Systematic racism is still not being validated by the United States authorities all over our country. And one way to understand historical trauma and how it is reacted to is based on how one responds to the symptoms of historical trauma. When Blacks self-medicated, there was a war on drugs that placed many, many, many in jail. When whites self-medicated, i.e. the opioid crisis, we were given treatment centers. American Jews have had access to the resources to treat the cause of our historical trauma. Blacks are being re-traumatized, and there can never come up enough for a breath of air to begin to treat the cause, but rather run from new trauma to new trauma. So what can we do about it? What must we do about it? We must get communal and individual support that we as white Jews need to treat our own trauma so we're in a healthy place to be good allies for others. We have to fight hard to listen to and follow the lead of BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color-led organizations. We need to work tirelessly to end systematic, institutionalized racism. Albert Einstein wrote, "The separation of the races is not a disease of the colored people, but a disease of the white people, and I do not intend to be quiet about it."